morning. Well, you know, I told you I've been pretty lonely in the Westminster studio. It's been a bit quiet, hasn't it, over August? But that means we've got to work that bit harder to get top draw for you in our MPs panel. And don't worry, we have not let you down this morning. We have found Conservative MP for Lewis, Maria Caulfield, former NHS nurse, campaigned for leave in the referendum, though the majority of her constituents voted to remain. She's also vice chair of the parliamentary group on the Irish in Britain, her parents having emigrated from Ireland. And I'm told, Maria, good morning.
Good morning.
That you look after sheep in your spare time.
I do. I haven't done any in the last few weeks, but yeah, we have some urban grazing happening in the South Downs, and I volunteer for that, so it's good fun. Get an excuse to get out.
Right, well, welcome to Five Live Daily. Lovely to have you on our
Thank
MPs
you.
panel. Also joining me is the Labour MP for Streatham and former Labour leadership contender Chuka Umunna, when not campaigning with the pro-European organisation Open Britain, a keen Crystal Palace fan, as well as being a former DJ. Chuka, good morning.
Hi there. Good morning.
We like to give a full introduction on this programme.
Thank you.
And last but not least, we have the SNP spokesman on culture and media, Brendan O'Hara, who's also been MP for Argyll and Bute since 2015. Brendan is an obsessive collector of football tops, to the point where he has thousands of football tops. Is this true?
I do. I also have a very understanding wife, I should add.
Second time you brought her up, apparently she likes me, but let's see if she does after we've had our conversation. Now, let's get to it with Brexit, if you don't mind, because we're getting all these very exciting position papers at the moment, which are giving us clues as to how we may Brexit. The UK government at midday today, well, very shortly, we'll bring you more details as we have it, will set out today what it calls its guiding principles with regards specifically to the influence of the European Court of Justice, the ECJ for short. It says it will not allow the ECJ to have what it called direct jurisdiction over UK affairs. But this fact infers that it could allow indirect influence, and that has been seen as a potential watering down of previous hardline, I put in quotation marks, statements. As a reminder, the European Court of Justice is the ultimate interpreter of EU law, and member states are required to give its judgment priority. Now, let's be honest, does it really matter if the ECJ is still able to have some influence over our affairs? If we have a UK-EU trade deal, does it make sense for the ECJ still to be involved? Surely it does, Maria Caulfield, even as an ardent Brexiteer.
Well, this position paper, which is being published today, is setting out the dispute mechanisms that are being set up as we leave the EU. What it's not doing is saying that the European Court of Justice will have any jurisdiction over UK law, but dispute mechanisms are routine when you're setting up deals, not just with the EU, but if we set up trade deals with Canada, the US, and Australia. So we also need to have these dispute mechanisms in place.
You're comfortable with this, that the ECJ could still have some influence over our affairs?
That's not what's been put out in the position paper. The dispute mechanism really is a tribunal arrangement where it will set out how, if there were a dispute, whether it be in family law, contract law, about citizens' rights, that the UK, how it would set out its side of the arbitration and how the EU would set out theirs, and how we would come to an agreement. Obviously, the European Court of Justice will influence the EU side of that arbitration, but what the position paper is not setting out is removing our promise to eradicate the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice over the UK.
No, but it'll still have a line into the UK, which some people will be very unhappy about. Bernard Jenkins, fellow Conservative MP, really wants this to be completely eradicated, doesn't want any form of indirect or direct jurisdiction.
Well, as I said, this mechanism of a dispute mechanism is exactly what will happen with the EU-Canada trade deal, and there is no suggestion there that the European Court of Justice, using that mechanism, will suddenly have influence or jurisdiction over Canadian law. And likewise, when we do that for the UK as we withdraw and set up our own agreements with the EU, there won't be a jurisdiction for the European Court of Justice. It will be a very different proposal.
Maria, let me bring in Chuka Umunna then. Is that your reading of this position paper, that it's just dispute mechanisms? The ECJ will have no future involvement with us?
Well, I think we have to look at this in the round. There were a set of promises made as part of the Brexit package which was sold to the British people, and one of those key promises was that if we vote to leave the European Union, European judges will have no influence on UK law going forward. Now, none of us have seen this position paper yet, but what we do know is that in the options that will be presented, there will be some mechanism, some group of judges, who knows who they will be, who will make a judgment on whether or not agreements between us and the EU are enforced. But in so doing, we know other similar mechanisms outside the European Union, like, say, the EFTA Court, they do tend to follow the judgments of the European Court of Justice. And so this notion, the promise that was made that European judges will have nothing to do with the interpretation of rules and regulations that impact on the United Kingdom, is being exposed as false. And this points to the wider problem, which is that...
So it's just very briefly on that point before you move to the wider
Yes.
point. Do you see this then as a climb down by Theresa May's government?
It absolutely is, because what she said, both rhetorically and, literally, was that European judges, and most importantly as well, the members of her cabinet who went around telling your listeners to vote for us to leave the European Union said this: European judges will have nothing to do with the interpretation and application of laws in our country. And clearly, with these proposals, as they've been briefed, that won't be the case. And
But Maria just said it's dispute negotiations. It's just a mechanism.
It's not just a mechanism, and I know Maria used to be a nurse. I used to be a solicitor for the best part of 10 years, and before I was elected, and I can tell you this isn't just a minor thing. This is about whether or not we pay attention to the jurisprudence, the judgments of European judges, and we will in some way, shape or form be doing that. And this is the bigger problem with Brexit, I think, at the moment, is that it is simply impossible to deliver in the terms that it was sold to the British people. When we were having that debate, and you've already said I was an arch Remainer, and I'm very proud to be so, during that referendum we were talking about hypotheticals and what we thought could happen. The difference between what happened during the referendum and now is that we're actually seeing the facts. And if you look at the list of key promises that were made to persuade people to vote to leave, £350 million extra per week into our public services, you won't be poorer. We'll still be able to have similar or the same trading arrangements with the EU. European judges will have nothing to do with UK law going forward.
So you're seeing as an
all of these things are proving to be absolutely impossible to deliver as we leave the European Union.
Brendan, I will bring you in just one moment. But Maria, could you come back on that specific point? Shuka sees this very clearly as a bigger picture of Theresa May not being able, with her government, to deliver that harder line Brexit, where you cut off everything to do with the European Union. What do you say to that? Because many people listening to this, like you, voted to leave.
Yeah, well, as Chucker said himself, he hasn't read or seen the position paper. And Dominic Raab, who's the Justice Minister, said on Radio 4 this morning and promised that in this dispute mechanism that will need to be set up, not just with the EU, but with any country that we trade with, there will be no judges, there won't be a court. It's an arbitrary system of arbitration, which will involve lawyers, but, that's not judges and courts in the EU making decisions in the UK.
But what he said, Maria, let's just look at exactly what he said. And this is what he said on the Today programme. There will be a divergence between the case law of the EU and the UK, fine. But he said the UK will keep half an eye on the case law of the European Union. Now that flies absolutely in the face of the promises that he made, you made, others made during that referendum.
I completely disagree. Because in the legal world, and you know this, Chucker, as a solicitor yourself, you do keep an eye on law, whether it's in this country, in the EU, or international law. It all has a bearing on decisions that are made in court. So, of course, you'll keep half an eye on EU, as they will do on UK law as we move forward.
The only, look, legally, when you are looking at precedent, the usual practice in UK courts is to follow the judgments and the precedents of other UK courts. Now, unless you're looking at grand matters of international law, generally speaking, that is the case. Now, we were told if we voted to leave the European Union, in that process, there will not be attention given to the judgments of the European Court of Justice and European judges. And now we are being told something quite different. And you cannot hide away from that.
You two are not going to agree on this. Let's bring in the SNP's Brendan O'Hara. What is your reading of it?
Well, I think Chuck is absolutely right when he says is that what we're seeing now is it is absolutely impossible to deliver the Brexit that people were promised.
Can we really see that just from this point, from these few position papers?
Well, absolutely you can. Because, it was all this, I would say, nonsense about taking back control, all this nonsense about, reverting into ourselves and having no, greater scrutiny or accountability, and it can't happen, and it's fraying at the edges as we speak. Now, we've had
Well, sorry,
but
just
we've
to
almost
be
had
clear,
silence.
we are leaving the single market and the customs union by March 2019. We have a time-limited transitional period. We don't know how far that time-limited period goes straight afterwards, but those two things are very clear from the architects of Brexit around that
If they
cabinet table.
go through Parliament.
Okay.
And absolutely, if they get through Parliament, but also, I mean, it's all very well us having headline statements saying this is what we will do. When it comes to the nuts and bolts of actually delivering it, the ECJ, they cannot deliver an ECJ. So how are they going to deliver on anything else? So what we've seen, 14 months of absolute silence from this government, and then we now have a flurry of position papers during recess when, as you say, none of us can see them, none of us have actually seen this. So what we are...
So you see that as a deliberate strategy to push these position papers out when people aren't...
Well, call me an old cynic after just 2 years in the job, but yes.
All right, old cynic. Let's put that to Maria Caulfield then. This is a deliberate strategy after 14 months of very little progress to put all these papers out, rush them out in the dead of August. What do you make of that?
Well, negotiations only started a few months ago, and I would have thought that, over the recess period is a good time to release papers. So when we go back in September, we've had a chance to read them and scrutinise them thoroughly. And I was on the Brexit Select Committee,
Yes.
and we have had information coming through, and I welcome more detail coming through because
I bet you do.
Absolutely.
After over a year.
Well, negotiations have only just started, let's be clear. And, Michel Barnier, who's leading the negotiations on the EU side, has also agreed that the way to come to an agreement in terms of our withdrawal process is to form a joint committee of the UK and the EU and not the European Court of Justice. So actually our position papers that we are releasing now fit very nicely into what the EU are suggesting also.
Can I just pick up on one thing? Because these position papers are one thing, but the number one promise that was made to the British people, Dominic Cummings, the head of the Vote Leave campaign, was clear it was crucial in ensuring that the Vote Leave campaign won that referendum, was that £350 million extra per week would come back to the UK and be ploughed into public services. Now, since Parliament rose back in July, it's very clear that the government has accepted the principle that we will be paying a divorce bill, as it were, for us to leave, and that there are likely to be ongoing payments to the European Union to secure access, albeit not membership, which I would prefer, but access to the single market. That very fact means it is impossible to deliver that £350 million extra per week to the NHS. That is now a fact.
And what's your point to Maria about that?
My point is, again, with these papers and what we are seeing during the summer are facts arising which illustrate it's impossible to deliver.
And do you think you've done a good enough job on the Labour benches? You have had all this time, as you've just pointed out, 14 months.
I've listened to some of your discussions with colleagues on this.
But have you had a good enough stab at holding this government to account about these positions? Because people from your benches are divided about their position on how Brexit should work. I had to ask one of your colleagues who sits in the shadow cabinet last week 5 times.
He's not the shadow cabinet,
but the shadow minister.
International trade minister, yeah.
But what I'm trying to say is, I had to ask him 5 times, would Labour, if they were in charge, if we had another general election before 2019, would you be leaving the customs union under Labour? And he couldn't answer the question.
Well, I'll tell you what the answer should be, in my view. The Labour Party, I've been absolutely clear about this, there should be clear red water between our position and Maria and Theresa May's position. Our position should be that at these negotiations we seek to keep the UK in the single market and in the customs union.
So that's at odds with Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah. Well, what Jeremy says
but
is
I'm trying to say there's not a united Labour bench on this.
But in fairness to the Labour Party, the country isn't united on this, and neither are the constituency Labour represents. I happen to represent Streatham, which I'm from and grew up in, and we scored the highest Remain vote in the EU referendum, and I'm very proud of that.
So I understand why you have that position, but do you accept on a broader level, especially as someone who ran briefly for that leadership, that there is consternation, there is frustration from Labour supporters that there isn't a united front on this and that you're not doing a good enough job opposing the government?
I think people want us to be giving a stronger line against Theresa May's job-destroying extreme Brexit.
Which isn't happening at the moment.
And what that means, an overwhelming majority of Labour Party members are clear they want the Labour Party in Parliament to be fighting for us to stay in the single market and the customs union, because those things are actually... It's about a lot more than the economy. What being a member of the single market enables us to be is part of this big motor for social justice that promotes environmental, worker rights and the rest.
We don't need to go over necessarily the argument for the single market. market on this particular day.
I
Brendan O'Mara.
think the parliamentary arithmetic could be so important if Labour had got their act together. You know, when Chucka put his United Kingdom remaining within the single market amendment just at the end of June, the entire SNP voted for it, you know, because we believed in it. But
his Labour Party didn't
but
get
Chucka
behind
could
it.
only, you know, get 50 of his own colleagues to do it. So I believe that if we were given a free vote, that there is enough support on the Labour benches, there's support on the SNP benches. You know, I believe there are enough soft Conservatives to make a real difference to this.
Politics
But
is always about being able to count, isn't
but
it?
the
And
problem
so
is
we will
that
see.
Jeremy Corbyn is just steamrolling ahead, allowing this hard Brexit to happen.
We are going to move on from this subject, but Chuka, is that frustrating for you on a personal level, what's just been said?
I want us to have a stronger position against the government's hard Brexit.
So yes,
and
that is frustrating.
It is frustrating for me, and for me, you know, ultimately, I have to act in the interest of my constituents.
Well,
and
you're
if
all-
I said
you're all constituent MPs.
if I said anything different.
You wouldn't be being treated.
And also, I mean, look, let's be honest about this. I was criticised for the timing of putting down the amendment, and the SNP supported it, Plaid supported it, the Liberal Democrats supported it, a substantial number of my colleagues supported it. But the problem is, the clock is ticking on this thing, and if, say, we waited to the autumn, coming off the back of what I think will be a very successful Labour conference, I would have been told, no, you can't do this, we can't, you know, have a debate about this. So then you go into the new year, and then people will say, but it's the start of a new, you can't do this thing. And so much time has been wasted. And I think if you want to have a withdrawal from the European Union, I wish we weren't having it, but if it's going to happen, I want it to be the least damaging, most beneficial form for the people that we represent.
Well, I'm sure
And
Maria would
we just
also
don't have
say,
the
I'm
time
sure
to
Maria,
waste
even as a
not
Maria,
making
you would
these
probably
arguments.
agree on that point. You want it to be as least damaging as possible, but you'll disagree probably on the journey to get there. Could I move us on to something completely different? Cannabis, because the new leader of the Liberal Democrats, Vince Cable, Sir Vince, has been creating something of a fuss by telling the BBC that the Lib Dems will keep pushing for the legislation of cannabis. So yes, take a breath, we are moving away from Brexit for a moment. He says it makes sense to regulate and control the market rather than let criminals control the mixing of substances. These are his words. The government says it has no plans to legalise cannabis. The position isn't changing. But let me just put this into a wider context for you. In America, 21 states have decriminalised the personal consumption. 8 have legalised the possession of small amounts of marijuana for recreational use. Next year, Canada is expected to go even further and legalise the drug. In Portugal, all drugs are decriminalised for personal use, which means in practice, if you're caught with a small amount, you won't be arrested. Maria, let me come back to you first of all. The government isn't changing its position, and yet the US, Canada, Portugal are all trying progressive approaches towards cannabis. Don't we risk as a country looking a bit backwards by not even debating some kind of liberalisation, especially when we know very potent forms of the drug, such as skunk, now exist and do immeasurable harm to people?
I mean, I'm very happy to have a debate about it, but the risks and the concerns that I have never been addressed. And, you know, there's 2 issues here. There's one about recreational use, but one also about medicinal use. And, you know, when I was nursing and I've worked in the field of cancer care, I used to have patients come and speak to me and say, could they use it for to prevent nausea, say, from their chemotherapy? But there's never been the evidence, there's never been the randomised controlled trials to actually compare the use of cannabis to the medicines that we have already today that are very effective. And so not only do we not have the evidence to support its use in medicinal purposes, we also don't have the evidence to support the side effects it can cause. And there's some real worry about even, you know, the mildest form causing mental health problems, causing psychosis. And even the WHO report a few years ago highlighted that as a side effect. So I do worry that there are some legitimate concerns that have not been addressed. And if there was the evidence to support that and to reassure me, that would be a different thing, but there isn't. And so for the moment, I wouldn't support legalising it.
Chuka, would you?
I wouldn't support legalising it or decriminalising it. I agree with some of what Maria said. I'm not perhaps as opposed to its medicinal use, but I think the argument often goes, well, look, you know, smoking cigarettes and drinking alcohol are legal and have been decriminalised, as it were. why not do the same with cannabis? Because actually it is, in terms of the harm caused to your body, it's not so severe. I just don't agree with that proposition.
But what about what Vince Cable's saying? He's going to stick with this policy. That's why we're discussing it. We're not just discussing it because it's around the world. It's very close to home that another party is doing this.
I disagree with him on that, and I disagree with the Liberal Democrats.
But what about the drug dealer side of it? It's better to have control.
I don't want to see people profiteering off the back of this. And there's two things that I come at this from two angles. I have dealt with cases as a constituency MP where I've had the parents of young people who've had marijuana-induced psychosis, who have been smoking skunk and other stronger forms of cannabis, which has caused severe mental health difficulties for young people going forward. So I just don't buy this argument that actually cannabis is not terribly harmful, because it can be, and in a way that other substances aren't. And just because cigarettes and alcohol are legal, it doesn't mean that we need to legalise all the other things that harm you. I think the second thing is that the risk of being accused of hypocrisy on this. I've admitted that I've taken cannabis myself in my earlier years. Is not something I'm proud of, and I certainly wouldn't recommend it to any young people. And I just think you've got to be open and honest about that, because otherwise somebody will pick me up on that. But as somebody who has tried cannabis,
you wouldn't support the legalisation.
I wouldn't support the legalisation. And in practice, actually, in terms of whether it's decriminalised, in practice it kind of is, because the police have, certainly in London, in my borough, we've got so many other issues that we're dealing with. It is not something they're not arresting every single person they see smoking a spliff, basically.
Maria, have you tried cannabis?
I haven't personally, but I've been a trustee of a housing charity called BHT Sussex, who deal with people who've become homeless through addiction. And the two things they say to me when they're going through recovery is that actually alcohol is as bad for them going through recovery when they're coming off drugs, because just because it's legal doesn't mean it enables safe use. But also to legalise cannabis would be a retrograde step for them.
They see it as that. Brendan O'Hara from the SNP benches. Any move or any interest from your party on changing position on this?
Well, I think if you split the two between the recreational use and the medicinal use, I think it's really important that there is that distinction.
And where do you stand?
Well, certainly on the recreational use, the SNP and certainly the Scottish Government are not in favour of legalising cannabis. But last year at the SNP conference we had a really, really interesting debate about the medicinal use of cannabis, and it was overwhelmingly passed by the delegates after a very informed and enlightening debate, and particularly hearing from MS sufferers, cancer sufferers, who at the moment, I presume illegally access the cannabis for medicinal use, or cannabis oil for medicinal use. It seems to play a particularly important part in their pain relief.
So on that you would support?
So absolutely. I think looking at the decriminalisation for medicinal use, yes, but the recreational use, no. I am absolutely not minded.
So not an overwhelming vote if Vince was ever to get that to the floor, it seems, in terms of a change. Well, we can come back to that, I'm sure, at a different point, but Sir Vince Cable sticking with that policy for the Liberal Democrats. Just time to ask my MPs about films, because I want to know, after Some Like It Hot has topped the BBC Culture poll of the 100 greatest comedies, bearing in mind there was 253 film critics from 52 countries to determine the funniest films ever made. That's what topped it. Annie Hall and Doctor Strangelove 2 and 3 respectively. What is your go-to film? Let me go to you first, Brendan O'Hara. When you want to switch off, when you want to kick back, feel better?
I absolutely love Kind Hearts and Coronets. Alec Guinness playing 8 different characters. He murders his entire family, playing the parts by himself in order to obtain his what he believes is his rightful inheritance. It's an absolutely wonderful film.
I've not seen this. I need to go and educate myself.
You must watch Kind Hearts and Coronets.
Is it actually funny?
It is wonderfully funny.
Okay, good, because it sounds like Game of Thrones of old.
Oh, no. It's so dark. It's a real dark comedy. 1949.
It's nice to know where you go to
Alec Guinness.
Okay, Chukwuemeka?
I'm not sure I could pick one film, but I've
been telling everyone mine's 4 Weddings and a Funeral.
Well, no, on the comedy front, Coming to America, Eddie Murphy. But if there's one film you go and see at the moment that came out in the last 12 months, go and see Hidden Figures, which is a just wonderful film about 3 women, African-American mathematicians who helped get the first American into space. And
an unknown story.
It's actually funny. It's an unknown story. It's a fantastic film for women, for people of colour, for everyone, and it's just so inspiring, and I think it's great for our young people to be watching it.
What's it
Because you know
called?
the whole Hidden Figures.
Hidden Figures.
Hidden
It's like
Figures
film
about
club
3
now.
African Americans
It's getting
who
way
worked
too
at
cosy between
NASA.
all of you. This is MPs. Let's remember this. Maria Caulfield, what's yours?
Oh, I'm very worried about Brendan now that he's
I know.
planning to murder everyone
Murdering
by
all the
himself.
family, yeah.
I know. Let's get him out of the studio quick. Come on.
I mean, for me, I love Mamma Mia because it's such a fun film. I love the songs and anything with Pierce Brosnan in
I was
it
about to
has
say,
be good.
is it Pierce?
And you know, when we've had such a grey and miserable August, you know, just imagining yourself on a beach on a Greek island, you know, is very relaxing indeed.
Well, let's get back to Brexit, hey, because you had too much of a break there for me. Thank you very much
You'll
to
need
all
your
of
passport
you.
to go
Yes.
to the future, yeah.
I knew there'd be a joke there. There was a Greek island mention, and Chuka got it in. Right. Chuka Amuna from Labour, Maria Caulfield from the Conservatives, Brendan O'Hara from the SNP. Thank you very much for being with Sports this morning.
Thank
Speak
you.
to you
Thank
again
you.
very soon. Coming up, we